So a few months ago, I made a video titled "These National Parks No Longer Exist," which was all about the 5 national parks that, well, no longer exist. Those were Mackinac, Platte, Sully's Hill, Fort McHenry, and Lincoln National Parks. You can go watch that video to learn more about those, because today we're actually continuing on with that same theme by talking about the rest of the national park sites that have since been delisted, deauthorized, or otherwise don't exist anymore. In this video, we're covering the national monuments, historic sites, battlefields, and more that no longer exist. Okay, before we get started, shout out again to Alex Conrad 2904 and Wilderness Will for the suggestion on this topic. Alex, I've already used your suggestion before the last time I did this topic, so thanks for the great list and for helping me to get my research started. All right, we're going alphabetically for these, and there's a lot to get through, so let's just jump right in, shall we? First up is the Atlanta Campaign National Historic Site, which protected the sites of 5 different locations associated with General Sherman's Atlanta campaign during the Civil War, but totaled only 21 acres among them. This site was first protected in 1944, but really only amounted to a series of roadside pullouts. Visitors were sparse and interest just never materialized, so the parks were transferred over to the state of Georgia in 1950. There is, however, still a national park unit associated with these events because they are interpreted at Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park just outside of Atlanta. Next, we have the Camp Blount Tablets National Memorial near Fayetteville, Tennessee. This is a bit of a weird one. It essentially just protected the rendezvous site of several different sets of troops from various U.S. military conflicts. Andrew Jackson's troops stopped by here during the War of 1812. More troops came by here during the Seminole Wars in the 1830s, and again, some more troops came by here during the Civil War. This site, again, amounted to little more than a roadside pullout, and it's possible that there was never even any federal acreage ever associated with it. It was abolished in 1944. Next is Castle Pinckney National Monument. This site is located in Charleston, South Carolina, smack dab in the middle of the harbor on Schuetz Folly Island. It was first protected in 1924 and transferred to the Park Service in 1933, but it was never developed for visitors. It's always been overshadowed by its more famous neighbors, Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie, but Castle Pinckney was actually the first place ever captured by Confederate forces during the Civil War, way back in December 1860, just a week after South Carolina seceded from the Union, and a full 4 months before the first shots of the American Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter. This site was abolished in 1956. Chattanooga National Cemetery used to be a national park site as well, having passed from the War Department to the Park Service in 1933. However, because the cemetery wasn't ever really connected to the battlefields the Park Service was already protecting in the area, it was delisted and returned to the War Department in 1944 before ultimately being passed on to the Veterans Administration in 1973. After that, we've got Father Millet Cross National Monument. This site holds the distinction as being the smallest unit ever to be part of the national park system. It was just 0.0074 acres and literally consisted of a single cross placed at the spot where the Jesuit priest, Father Pierre Millet, had placed just a marker of gratitude in 1688. The site was established in 1924, transferred to the Park Service in 1933, and ultimately abolished in 1949. The cross still stands today, and you can view it at Fort Niagara State Park near Buffalo, New York. Next, we have Fossil Cycad National Monument. I'm not going to go into detail here because I have a whole video on this one, which you can check out if you want to learn more. Moving on to Holy Cross National Monument, another pretty weird one. This site was proclaimed by Herbert Hoover in 1929 to protect the Mountain of the Holy Cross in Colorado. The mountain became famous because during a particular time of year, snow would accumulate in a vertical crevice on the mountain and along some horizontal ledges cutting across that crevice, giving the appearance of a cross. People would come here for religious pilgrimages, and it did get pretty popular. Light infrastructure was developed in the area to help people come and visit it. but as soon as the Park Service took it over in 1933, visitors pretty much just stopped coming, and then it was completely closed to visitors because of troop training during World War II. The site was delisted in 1950 and transferred back to the Forest Service, where it remains today as part of the White River National Forest. Next, there's the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. Yes, it was an MPS unit from 1972 to 1994. It was a headache for the Park Service because of budgetary concerns, and it was also largely outside the scope of the Park Service responsibilities, which is ultimately why Congress delisted it. Park Service does, however, still manage a performing arts park in Wolf Trap, which I have a whole video about and highly recommend. Next, we move on to the Lewis and Clark Cavern National Monument, located in southwestern Montana. This cave was proclaimed as a national monument in 1908 by Teddy Roosevelt, but just never developed any visitor infrastructure. Common theme here. The CCC did come through here though and eventually add that infrastructure, but the park had already been abolished in 1937 and transferred to Montana as a state park. Moving on, we have Mar-a-Lago National Historic Site. Yes, that Mar-a-Lago, it used to be part of the National Park System. I have a whole video on this one as well, so we're just gonna move on. That leads us to the National Visitor Center, another very expensive snafu in the heart of Washington, D.C. This park unit was pretty much just as it sounds, a visitor center for our nation's capital. There were plans for an elaborate 100-foot AV screen, a hall of state, a bunch of state-of-the-art theaters, a 500-car parking garage, and oh yeah, they wanted to move Union Station over a quarter-mile away. Originally budgeted for $15 million, this thing ballooned into a boondoggle of over $100 million, but nobody visited, its roof collapsed, it had a pigeon infestation and a fungus problem, and it was finally put out of its misery in 1981. Luckily, we got a really good Union Station out of it though. This next one is pretty cool, the new Echota National Memorial. This site marked the location of the former Cherokee capital of New Echota, located near present-day Calhoun, Georgia. The Cherokee occupied this land until 1838, when they were forcibly removed during the Trail of Tears, and eventually knowledge of the site kind of just faded. A national memorial was created here in 1930 and transferred to the Park Service in 1933. In 1950, though, a group of locals rediscovered the actual site through archaeological excavations, but the site that the National Memorial was on, which was less than an acre, was not part of the land that they had acquired as part of that project, and so this park unit was just abolished in 1952. The site today is a Georgia State Historic Site. The Oklahoma City Memorial used to be an NPS site, but it was delisted and became an affiliated site rather than a full NPS unit in 2007. Another unique one is the Old Kasaan National Monument. Proclaimed by President Wilson in 1916, this site of only 38 acres was located on the Prince of Wales Island in Alaska, not far from the town of Ketchikan. It protected a Haida indigenous site, in particular a set of totem poles along the shore. The site was too remote, however, and no one really visited, so it was delisted in 1955 and returned to the U.S. Forest Service as part of the Tongass National Forest. The totem poles were removed to Ketchikan to be placed on display at the Totem Heritage Center. Papago Saguaro National Monument existed from 1914 to 1930, protecting 2,000 acres of sprawling desert habitat, basically right in the heart of downtown Phoenix. When it was delisted, it was originally transferred to the state of Arizona, but today exists as a Phoenix City Park. A nice one from what I've heard. St. Thomas National Historic Site was located in the Virgin Islands. It protected the oldest building there, a Danish construction called Fort Christian. It was established in 1960, but was delisted when the contemporary uses of the building kind of failed to mesh with the historic preservation role the Park Service was supposed to be playing. You can still learn about the Danish history on the Virgin Islands, though, at Christiansted National Historic Site on St. Croix. Next, we have Shoshone Caverns National Monument, a cave outside of Cody, Wyoming. Originally protected in 1909 by Howard Taft because of its quote-unquote impenetrable pits of unknown depth, it was never developed for visitors and failed to live up to other MPS caves like Mammoth Cave, Wind Cave, and Carlsbad Caverns. It was abolished in 1954 and run privately until 1966. To this day, this is the only park on this list that is no longer publicly accessible. This next one is also pretty unique, Verendrye National Monument. It is the only park on this list to have been decommissioned because the historical events it was proclaimed to protect actually never happened. Supposedly, this was the spot on which the French explorer Sieur de la Verendrye, quote-unquote, first saw beyond the Missouri River. Turns out Verendrye definitely did not do that here, and so the site was abolished in 1956. Wheeler National Monument was located in a remote area of southwest Colorado and was first proclaimed in 1908 by Teddy Roosevelt, becoming an NPS unit in 1933. It protected some unique geologic features in the area, but was too remote and inaccessible and didn't get many visitors, so it was delisted and turned back over to the Forest Service as part of the Rio Grande National Forest in 1950. White Plains National Battlefield Site was a Revolutionary War site protected under the War Department in 1924 and transferred to the Park Service in 1933, but the feds never even acquired property here, and basically no development was undertaken to make the site accessible for visitors. It was delisted in 1956. And finally, there are 5 former Reservoir National Recreation Areas that used to be under NPS jurisdiction, but are no longer. They are Shasta, Millerton Lake, Lake Texoma, Shadow Mountain, and Flaming Gorge. So there you have it. You now have the full list of every National Park Service site to no longer exist. 25 total in this video, plus the 5 national parks in my first video. And something like this exercise really gives you a sense of how much the Park Service has changed throughout its history. We're used to redesignations and sites changing statuses, but rarely do we see sites delisted and abolished from the national park system completely. Many of the sites we've discussed today are largely forgotten to history, but I don't think that makes them any less significant. Ultimately, they're still part of the history of national parks in this country, even if they're not national parks anymore. That is all I have for you. I'd love to know if you visited any of these. Let me know down in the comments below. Direct support is always appreciated on Patreon, and be sure to follow me over on Instagram for channel updates and pretty park pictures. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.